Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a great tour of the seaplane harbor or of Tallinn Old Town. I had a nice tour in Kadriorg, so now we are refreshed and can sink our teeth into something that's very meaty and very important now, and that is everything that concerns the Arctic. My name is Konstantin Eggert, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I think that we have a very interesting panel of people who are both practitioners of policy and people who analyze policies. And I suppose that the issues that we're going to discuss have suddenly become pretty much in the focus of policy analysts and politicians in the last few weeks and months, also because of the Crimea, because it seems like the idea of this global competition and probably now even global confrontation is tickling everybody's nerves. And the Arctic has been pretty much in the headlines for the last few years, the new frontier of economic development and the new front in what used to be called the Cold Peace until recently, with Russia and other powers bordering or surrounding the Arctic area, trying to lay claims to their own interests and actually sometimes to define their interests. And I think that that's what we're going to discuss today. Are these interests well defined? What are they? And to what extent military and economic aspects of the whole Arctic issue are compatible? And we have a very distinguished panel, and I would like to start with Espen, Barth, Eide. I hope I pronounced the name right. He's a former defense and foreign minister of Norway and currently with the World Economic Forum. I looked up what you all were writing and saying about the Arctic recently, and Espen, your interview with Der Spiegel when you were foreign minister struck me as an interview that could have been conducted, or rather that an interview of someone who's sounded more like a CEO of a company than a minister, because he was so vigorously defending the interests of Norwegian business and generally business interests in the Arctic, saying that, okay, yeah, we should pay attention to environmental issues, but it is very good for business that you can explore the Arctic. I mean, you really sounded very American, not Norwegian to me, at least. So may I suggest that you kick off the discussion. Is it really such a huge business proposition, the Arctic? And isn't it slightly smudged by the recent events when the idea of geopolitical confrontation comes back to haunt us?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Konstantin. I will answer all of that. Let me first say I'm really happy to be here at the Lennart Meri conference again. Always interesting, particularly interesting this year with the dramatic backdrop, and very important, and also to share this panel with very good friends and excellent experts on the Arctic, and also to be part of the first gender-balanced panel so far in the program. To your point, I think the question I think we shall be discussing here, we have had some interaction between the people up here, is will the current climate of constructive cooperation in the Arctic be continued, sustained, despite of the geopolitical drama that comes out in the Ukraine and over the Ukraine issue? Or will even the Arctic cooperation be tainted by geopolitical confrontation? So if the question is, will we be able to maintain good cooperation? My answer will be yes, but. And that's where I think where we should steer the debate. It's not obvious, but I think the answer is yes, but. On your specific question, what has been our point, and now our now means Norway. I'm now putting on my old hat as representing sort of the former Norwegian government's perspective on this, which is, by the way, I think quite similar to the current Norwegian government and more than the World Economic Forum perspective, but the forum also works actively on this issue, mainly on the same lines, is that the Arctic is de facto opening up. It's not a question whether it will be an area for economic activity. That's that has happened for a long time. It will be more, and it will be more because the ice is retracting. There will be less ice, more water is open for exploitation of minerals, of oil, gas, fishing. That's going to happen because there is nothing to make it not happen. However, there are a whole series of particular challenges that have to be dealt with, some which are the same as in other parts of the world, some which are unique to the Arctic, which is why it has been very important to put a very strong emphasis on the need to take a cooperative approach and to try to make this an area where cooperation trumps confrontation and where we change a perception of problem between states to a perception of problems that states share and deal with together. And I think because a number of us, including my own country, but also a number of other countries, saw around 10 years ago that the Arctic activity would grow exponentially in the coming years. That we could either wait to see what happened, or we could start to organize ourselves around that. So we chose the latter, and we did so by insisting on that UNCLOS, the Law of the Seas Convention, should be applied. And in 2008, in a very important meeting of the Arctic ministers at Greenland, there was an agreement just to state, which is in principle obvious, but it was an important statement from all the Arctic, the main Arctic countries, that UNCLOS will apply to any dispute between states over jurisdiction in the Arctic, including the US. Because the bad news about the US is that it hasn't signed UNCLOS. The good news that it still applies all its obligation. It lives up to all its obligations. It's only preventing itself from living up to its rights, claiming its rights. And it beats me why that's smart, but that's up to the American voters, not me. But still, all the countries agree that UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Seas Convention, should apply. That's an important agreement. The second one was to strengthen institutions that already existed, but had a less dominant role, including the Arctic Council. That was also quite successful. So all the Arctic countries actually agree on the rules of the game when it comes to distinguishing what belongs to whom. And all the Arctic countries agree that there is one specific institution, which is the circumpolar institution of the Arctic Council, which shall be used to deal with some specific Arctic questions. And the Arctic Council has, over the last years, taken its first formal decisions on formal interstate agreements, including one on search and rescue, another one on oil spills, and so on. So the point is not arguing for or against business activity. It's kind of concluding that business activity will happen, it can happen, but it must happen in a responsible way. Fisheries has been well managed in this region. This is an area where the fish stocks, for instance, those in the Barents Sea, have been very well maintained through international cooperation, even in the Cold War, because there were agreements on quotas and so on that actually were largely respected. And then the new theme which came up and which is going to be quite dominant is that there is now an opportunity to sail further north and to sail through the Arctic, through the Northeast Passage. And it's not only, when we started working on this 10 years ago, it was a theory that it could possibly happen. What we're seeing now, 10 years later, is that there are more and more of it actually happening. So the Arctic as an ocean is connecting the three most dynamic regions of the world, which is East Asia, North America, and Europe, and can in a quite fundamental way transform the sort of logistical transport landscape. And that also means that it was important for us to open up to some of the Asian partners when they wanted to be observers in the Arctic Council. We had a very interesting debate at the ministerial meeting in Sweden under the excellent Swedish chairmanship, which ended then in May. And the conclusion was that we opened up for a number of new observers, including China, India, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. Singapore is not a particularly Arctic country, although it is on the northern hemisphere. It's 1 degree above the equator, so it's kind of on the right side. But they're very interested in this because as a major shipping hub, they of course also see that there's sort of global transformation when you can start to sail a much shorter route between Asia and Northern Europe and even the northern part of east coast of America, that matters. So the whole idea here has been to, in due time, before too much activity was going on, to shape a climate of cooperation. That was the good news. Now, to end my initial part is to say the problem, of course, is that we don't yet know how this will fare given a more complicated climate between the West and Russia. And I would suggest that if it is drawn into this geopolitical drama, that's rather bad news, because it has been obviously bad news for those of us who normally live up there. I don't live there now because I live in Geneva, but I still have my affinities up there. But also because it was on a much bigger scale, because it was an area where we could relate to Russia as a relatively normal state that sort of behaved according to international rules and actually lived up to its obligations. And that's, that could be, as a laboratory of where one could try to get together again, it would be quite important to maintain a kind of a climate of cooperation in the Arctic, which is why I think one should invest in keeping it that way. There's a Russian military buildup going on, and I want to say, and we're going to speak more about that, I know, but I want to say I have a mixed mind on that. There is a part of which is of course concerning, that is the heavy investment in nuclear capability, where we see both nuclear weapons and missiles and so on being developed in the whole triad. And we clearly see from exercise patterns that Russia is again thinking of, in the situation of a full-scale confrontation with the West, developing a bastion defense, where many countries in the north will be on the wrong side of the bastion defense. That's a problematic part. But the other part, which is often misunderstood, is the part which is simply to increase Russian authority along the North-East Passage. That's actually something which I think is good, because there's an enormous void up there, and a lot of ships going back and forth. There is very little human activity there. There's a few helipads, few hospitals, few ports. So, if the Russians want to invest in making that lane sort of more navigable simply by having a more presence, even if it's military, that's probably something that we can live quite well with. So it's important to sort of reach out and make sure that despite of the sort of general geopolitical drama, this has been an investment over the last 10 years, which has been worthwhile, and one should try to keep it like that. Of course, not at any cost, but one should try to keep a climate of cooperation, so it will continue to trump confrontation.
Well, you were wearing your diplomat's hat, definitely now. Very briefly, as a follow-up, personally, do you believe that the Arctic Council, which you described as a very sort of workable arrangement, that it will not be impacted by the current crisis?
Of course it will be impacted to a certain extent. The question is to which extent. There are no reports of meetings where there's some of the Russian, on expert level, where the Russian representatives do not come, for instance. So there have been some, less optimistic signs. But it's too early to say, actually, what it means to the broader cooperation. Because, in a sense, the investment in raising, the awareness of the UNCLOS and the Arctic Council together can be understood on two levels. So the most basic level is to reduce the risk of conflict between states. I think that's probably going to be maintained. Mm-hmm. And then the next level is to deal with shared challenges. And that's where I think we have to watch closely what's happening.
Thanks a million. And I think that we already mentioned Russia being a key player in the Arctic, and of course having the biggest, if you watch, maritime border with the area. And what we've heard over the last few days coming out of Moscow, actually coming out of President Putin's office, is that Russian military presence there is going to be strengthened. New investment is going to go to strengthening military capabilities and creating what was called, I think, the unified command of the sort of in the Arctic area. And I would like to go now to Niklas Granholm from the Swedish Defense Research Institute for you. And Niklas, I read some of the stuff that you wrote recently, and what you said is quite interesting to me as a Russian, actually, and a taxpayer. That is that, on the one hand, the desire for economic development of the region was and is quite strong. Russia really guns for the mineral resources that are there, and that means developing the infrastructure and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. But on the other hand, all the securitization of the Arctic area, the view of the Arctic area as some kind of geopolitical playground, actually contradicts the goal of opening it up for investment and for developments. How you think that's going to play out both for Russia and for other Arctic countries?
Thank you, Konstantin, for that question and also the nice introduction here. And thank you also to the organizers. This is my first visit to the LMC conference, and it's great to be here as a speaker as well. I'll answer Konstantin's question, but I'll try to give a bit of a more perspective on this. And this will be, of course, a bit of a motorcycle ride through the issues here, but that's what we're here for. So, as Espen pointed out, we are getting towards a new Arctic due to climate change, and this leads to a number of follow-on effects, and I'd like to dwell on them for some time. I'd also like to discuss some of the regional effects that we will see.
Within the confines of, say, 7-8 minutes, no more.
Well, absolutely, of course. I thought we had 10, but by the way, so...
I'm changing the line. You know, I come from Moscow. I changed the rules on the call.
Well... the rules have been written before, and I don't subscribe.
You want to play handball? We'll play hockey. No problem.
Well, I've stopped the clock here now. So okay. Anyway, military strategic change is one part of this change as well, and also a few words on what I think the Ukraine crisis is going to entail, and also what will be on the agenda for the coming near future here in the next few years. But the new Arctic here is driven by climate change, and we've all heard this. And the IPCC, the UN climate panel, shows this very clearly in its latest report. They confirm that the ice melt is about twice as fast, and climate change is about twice as fast in the Arctic as the rest of the world. And it's more firm, there's more data. But the key question is, of course, how fast is the ice melt here? And it seems to me that the climate models, when you look at them, they most seem to capture the ice melt, but not they underestimate the speed which the ice melt takes place. And you have extremes here. One group of analysts are talking about a near ice-free Arctic by 2050. And some are, the more extreme are talking about an ice-free Arctic summer by 2020. Not too far away. So we actually need a better prediction. The span is too wide here, and this is what is acknowledged also by the natural scientists. The follow-on effects are numerous. Energy and mineral extraction will increase both at sea and on land. We will have new transoceanic shipping lanes. It is not only the Northern Sea route, it is also the Northwest Passage, and also a notional Northern Polar route, a great circle through the North Pole that's happening here. And how fast these will develop depends partly on the ice melt, but also on how much money and resources are put into the infrastructure to develop them. Fisheries will be affected. They are well run, as Espen pointed out, but fish move with the temperature of the water. If that changes, maybe the fisheries you had, you no longer have, and those who didn't have them suddenly have them. We shall see. We also see an increased human activity in the form of tourism, cruise ships going up there. There is a huge risk here that we will see a major disaster in the coming years. The area is also very sensitive. It needs a lot of environmental protection as well. And there is also, in addition, a lot we don't know about how the Arctic actually functions. More scientific research is needed into getting a better grip on this. The new Arctic, as Espen also alluded to, has led to that we have a number of new actors in the Arctic. It's not only the coastal states and the Arctic 8, which is larger than the Arctic 5 group, which I can point out. There are also other state actors, non-state actors. They're regional, they're external to the region, and they're multilateral and NGOs. And also the institutional developments done to try and meet this is important. First and foremost is, as you said, Espen, the Arctic Council. And they have now a proper budget, they have a secretariat, they have a better information management, and they've also brought in a number of observers, and then the oil spill and search and rescue deal. So that's huge improvements, though they are not allowed to discuss anything on military security, and I'll return to that later. The ice melt also means that the military strategic role of the Arctic is actually changing. So all this leads to that we have a new and geopolitically more important Arctic emerging. And this region can no longer be seen in isolation from the rest of the world. Moreover, the factors I mentioned develop according to their own speed and inner logic. How might they interact? They might cancel each other out, or they might reinforce each other in ways we can't really foresee. So it could be that we're actually approaching a non-linear moment here in Arctic affairs. But that's something we won't know until we see it. Turning to a regional perspective here, if we start in the West Atlantic, I believe that Greenland seems to be heading for full independence from Denmark. It's a kind of a slow motion divorce here. And the issue is, of course, whether Greenland can find the money to run the country. Can you find the expertise on a population of 57,000 to run the country efficiently? So 2 scenarios here. One is a Qatar in the Arctic, rich, where all the income from gas, oil, hydroelectric power pays for Greenland's upkeep. Or another extreme will be Micronesia in the Arctic. Nationalism takes hold, independence is there, but there's very little resources to uphold the sovereignty of the country. Moving to the east, Iceland, 2008, we saw the spectacular financial crisis there. This is not really recovered. Iceland is probably hit the bottom, but they're not recovered yet from it, and the krona is still not convertible, and foreign direct investment is practically zero. On national security, the Keflavik Naval Air Station was closed in 2006 after 65 years, and the US permanent presence there ceased. This was replaced by air policing, but this is an intermittent air policing, 2 or 3 weeks per quarter. The rest of the time it's empty. The question is today, with Russia's resurgent activities up there, is today's solution on defense policy out of step with strategic developments in the region? Iceland has also put EU accession on hold, transatlantic relations, US relations. I'm not really clear on what this is doing, but what I hear is also that Iceland wants to become an Arctic hub. Everything Arctic should be Iceland. So to sum this up, Iceland's problems are long-term, and the rest of us have to pay attention to this. Third and last, the Barents Sea region. This is a nexus of everything new in the Arctic. Shipping, military strategic interest, energy, and also a sensitive environment, and also now strong economic growth and lots of people moving in there. And if you put all this together, you get a new North Atlantic region emerging here. And if we then put into, as a wild card, the possibility of an independent Scotland after the referendum in September, things are starting to get interesting in this part of the world. And if you turn then to the security dimensions of the new Arctic, we have 3 here. I would say one is policies of sovereignty assertion. Not terribly controversial, but it's also a matter of very much Coast Guard types of tasks. And there is a renewed drive for more resources to solve these tasks. Not controversial in my view, but it's there. The Arctic also plays a role as a nuclear strategic arena. This has been the case since the early 1960s and onwards, but with the ice melt, how will this affect operational concepts and future investment, and what kind of impact will it have on strategic stability in the longer run? And lastly, the development of a ballistic missile defense system actually also matters to the Arctic, since most of the possible trajectories between hypothetical opponents goes across the Arctic. There's also the issue that we've seen a focus from land-based system towards more of sea-based components in the system. And if there's rapid ice melt, will it mean that more resources of this system is operating further and further to the north, and what will be the effects of this? So all in all, we have a changing military strategic role for the Arctic. It implies more military activity, but it doesn't mean necessarily an increased risk of open conflict. All this will depend on the context, and I'll return to that later. So putting all this together, I think that Arctic uncertainty is the new normal here. This is what we're facing. And I mentioned earlier the non-linear moment in Arctic affairs. We may be approaching that point. So I think that professionally optimistic statements on how well everything is going in the Arctic should be taken with a pinch of salt. Ukraine crisis, this will affect cooperation. Espen alluded to it, but there is a spillover effect here. I think we can say as much. Meetings are being cancelled. They're carried out on a low level. Cooperation is not carried out in the nice structures that we've worked a long time to build up. And I think we can look at two scenarios here. One would be that we try to put everything Arctic in a box and say that, right, it's business as usual. We disagree on almost everything else, but we'll try to cooperate in the Arctic as well. Anyway, and the other one will be that it breaks down and we'll have geopolitical strife going on, and we'll have a 21st century version of the great game that plays itself out in the Arctic. Those are the extremes as I see it. So what are the issues then on the agenda? And I'm getting almost to the end here. I think that what this calls for is a new thought process on confidence and security building measures in the Arctic. We have a new setup here, and it affects us readily. There are a number of informal arrangements here to discuss hard security as well. Arctic Security Forces Roundtable is one of them. Should these be formalized in any way, or is it all good and well to continue in the same way that we're doing now? I also believe that we need to think about rules of the road for the activities in the Arctic that need to be developed. There are even parts of the agreements that we had during the Cold War that could be revisited again, incidents at sea and the like. And also one task is to protect and defend the institutional gains that we've already done. So I think those are the most important things. To sum this up, we have a new and different Arctic that is emerging here. It's driven by the ice melt, and the follow-on effects here develop according to their own inner logic and speed. The interaction is hard or even impossible to predict, and we therefore may be closer to a non-linear moment here. So we have to protect the institutional achievements and develop new appropriate ones. And this is it. A new Arctic will emerge, whether we like it or not. It will not bend to our will. Thank you.
Thanks a million. Niklas, I think I'll consider that you spend already your time on the follow-up question. And we'll go straight to Heather Conley from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Heather, one of the most impressive things on the Arctic section of your website is this presentation of a map of Arctic looking from the North Pole. And even for someone who knows a bit of geography, it's quite an impressive sight to see what kind of space we're talking about. And on the other hand, as far as I understand, everyone talks about the US being an Arctic power, but what we hear in debates, we hear more Nordic voices, let's put it like that, than the American voice. So is America only a notional Arctic power, or it does have an interest, and will this interest increase in the new political climate?
Well, we are getting in touch with our Arcticness slowly, but we are getting there. Thank you, Konstantin. Matt, thank you, Polly. This is a wonderful conference, and I think any think tanker who knows how much work goes into producing one of these recognizes that. So thank you so much. Great to be with you this afternoon. I think the Arctic, we can safely say, is truly a first 21st century challenge. It is a climate change challenge. We are facing a new ocean. It's like Columbus. We're discovering something completely new. The climate change, what we are seeing, the scientists tell us this is stunning and profound. The models have to be redone so frequently because the change is happening so rapidly. And so while we're grappling with this change and this new ocean, we are seeing where geoeconomics are what is shaping the future of the Arctic. So your question, Konstantin, to Espen about the economics, it is the economics that is in fact driving this region. And the other principal driver and most dynamic element of the Arctic is the Russian Arctic, with over 50% of the Arctic coastline believed to be 70% of the oil and gas resources in Russia's exclusive economic zone. Russia is a superpower in the Arctic, and they have an enormous amount at stake. So I view the Arctic as sort of a geopolitical weather vane. If you look at it historically, going back even to the Second World War, it was the critical supply routes, for, the famous Murmansk supply routes, and it was a vital supply route for the Second World War. And then, of course, during the Cold War, we had action above the ice and under the ice with the submarines. It was sort of that playground, if you will, for the Cold War. And then in 1987, Gorbachev, his famous speech in 87 about the Arctic becoming a zone of peace. The ice began to crack, both for the Cold War as well as for the Arctic. Our Finnish colleagues picked up on that, started to think, well, how can we focus on the environmental sustainable development in the Arctic? That matured eventually in 1996 into the Arctic Council, and now we are here today. So, what does the political weather vane point now with the Ukraine crisis? I would argue that the weather vane is pointing to, unfortunately, some very stormy weather. Let's look at the Arctic before February the 21st and then after February the 21st. Absolutely, as Espen and Niklas have portrayed it, the Arctic was a strong area of regional cooperation based on the framework of the Law of the Sea Treaty. Although the United States has not ratified it, that has not stopped this cooperation from happening in the Arctic. You have the Arctic Council with the indigenous peoples around the table, the permanent participants, which is what makes the Arctic Council truly a unique intergovernmental forum. And then you have this sort of spontaneous experience where the Arctic states look and they say, well, we have a little gap here. We need a search and rescue agreement. So we're going to use this framework. It's not the Arctic Council. We're going to use this framework and we're going to forge a search and rescue agreement. Who led that task force? The United States and Russia. Oh, we need a little help in figuring out oil spill response and prevention in the Arctic. Oh, we're going to use the framework again. We're going to have US, Russia, and Norway help us lead that. So this is the momentum in the international cooperation that was happening, and then Ukraine happened. So what are we seeing now? Well, we saw a few weeks ago that a senior Arctic official meeting in Canada, Canada is now the chairman of the Arctic Council, was held. And the Russians participated in that. And we all sort of went, whew, okay, so far so good. But we had for the first time an Arctic Coast Guard Forum, an idea that I have to boast a little bit, CSIS has been promoting in a lot of our written work as a way to give some structure to how we practice and implement our search and rescue. The Russians were not invited. At a working group meeting on the environment from the Arctic Council, that didn't happen. And we, of course, know that the mill-to-mill context and some of the operations and the exercises that were supposed to be held both for Norway, for the US in the Arctic have been canceled. So we have a very mixed picture. But this does not deter Russia. Again, Russia has an enormous amount at stake in the Arctic. I think it was in 2008, then Prime Minister Medvedev said, for the Arctic, it is Russia's future energy resource base. The oil and gas and the minerals, we can't forget. We talk about the oil and gas. Quite frankly, I think the U.S. unconventional revolution and shale gas and tight oil is beginning to challenge a little bit on Arctic oil and gas development. But we have the discovery of rare earths, Greenland, potentially, the palladium, the nickel, the zinc, the 21st century minerals that our economies need are very much found in the Arctic. Russia needs those resources. Russia also sees the Northern Sea route as a future major transit route. I don't think any of us believe this is the next Suez Canal, but the Russians have an ambitious vision for creating a major transit route through the Northern Sea route. And I think what's come out through a variety of our conversations the last 2 days is, President Putin is very clear. He gives us a lot of speeches, and we should listen to those. And he's talking a lot about the Arctic. Read the Russian Arctic strategies to 2020. They're extraordinarily ambitious. I don't know if they'll be able to accomplish them, but they're creating new structures, the Northern Sea Route Administration. They are focusing very much on the economic development of it. And Mr. Putin speaks annually at a Russian-sponsored, Russian Geographic Society-sponsored International Arctic Forum. So we know that there's top priority by the Russian government. We know they are allocating resources. They have a vision. And of course, as Espen was suggesting, as well as Nikolai, we are beginning to see, I think, some changes here in resources, not only to the Northern Fleet, but also some dual-use purposes, civil and military use in the search and rescue. So I think about September, so things began to change a little bit in the Arctic for Russia. I think the Greenpeace, the seizure of the Greenpeace ship, the Arctic Sunrise, this had happened before, a year before, and Russia took care of it. It's an illegal entry into territorial waters, okay. But this reaction was an overreaction to this incursion. And in fact, the overreaction became much more of the international story than the actual event that took place. I think we also saw, although it was not officially part of Zapad exercises last fall, the exercises around the Kola Peninsula give some pause. Russia's reopening closed military installations, the dual use I mentioned, and we're starting to see the nationalistic rhetoric beginning to creep into the Arctic conversation, and I had not really seen that really over the last few months. Espen's absolutely right. We have a new border to protect, and Russia has the largest border, and so they must beef up their border security. And again, they have a vision for greater commercial use of the Northern Sea Route. This is natural, but I think we're starting to see where we're tilting. So finally, where do we go from here if we believe the political weather vane is pointing to stormy storms in the Arctic? I think the best we can hope for right now, and this has implications because in 12 months the United States becomes the next chairman of the Arctic Council, we really have to preserve and protect the 10 years of cooperation that we have achieved. And I think the only way we do that is to return the Arctic Council much more to a technical body. Keep that good and important work going in the working groups. But I have to tell you, 6 months ago, I wanted to see the most ambitious U.S. chairmanship you can imagine with the U.S.-Russian bilateral relationship, moving it forward. That's changed. We're not going to accomplish that, quite frankly. Now we have to preserve and protect what we've gained over the last 10 years. Because the Arctic is so critical for Russia, I would, and certainly Russia cannot develop its offshore oil and gas capabilities without Western know-how, without Western investment. If I was providing advice to the Department of Treasury on targeted sanctions, I'd say that's where you go. If you're going to hurt Russia, you go straight there, and that will in fact impair them from developing the Arctic. As the Siberian fields begin to diminish, they really do need that Arctic exploration. But the consequence of that is if the Western companies pull away, and I believe it was a very senior Russian official that recently said, companies, if you leave, you're never coming back, or something to that effect. The consequence will be Russia will continue to explore at great risk, at heightened risk of accidents, and one accident in the Russian Arctic affects the entire circumpolar Arctic, and one major catastrophe is a catastrophe for the entire region. So we have to think very carefully about how we think about sanctions. I think what we're going to see, very unfortunately, is that Russia, if in fact we see that the Eurasia Union is going to hit some troubles, this will make Russia's view and Russia's engagement in the Arctic so much more important and nationalistic in some ways. And I think we have to be cautious about that. 2 final points. NATO needs to understand these dynamics. NATO is not the first instrument of choice, I assure you, but a very wise former Norwegian foreign and defense minister taught me that Article 5 extends into the Arctic, as 4 coastal states are NATO members. NATO assets could be deployed for a search and rescue operation. So NATO needs to understand these new dynamics. NATO also needs to understand China's presence in the Arctic, which has some strategic implications as well. And finally, the United States needs to get much more strategic about the Arctic. We are writing some really interesting strategy documents. We're writing them, that's good, but there's not the budget, there's not the strategy, there's not looking at this new ocean and saying, how does American leadership engage here? And hopefully the US chairmanship will give us that opportunity to take a bolder step in that strategy. Thanks, Konstantin.
Heather, one more short follow-up. Actually, you took the words right out of my mouth, and I wanted to ask you about China and about the now famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, tour of the Snow Dragon icebreaker in the Arctic. How is the Chinese desire to be present in the Arctic? Okay, just to wave the flag, even. How it is perceived in Washington? Is it perceived as something that is kind of checking Russia's influence there and just showing that there is a multitude of interests that are not necessarily only centered in the region, or taking into account all this kind of new Asian challenges attitude in Washington? Is it seen as a, well, if not a threat, then a challenge?
I think we're watching it. I don't think it's perceived as a threat or a challenge. In fact, as the Arctic Council deliberated about the permanent observer question, and certainly China was the question to that, the US didn't really have a position. We played an honest broker, which was actually a very vital role. I don't mean to be critical of it. We didn't have a view on it. So that tells me that we're not focusing as much as we should and understanding that China's presence is only going to grow in the Arctic. Not only their presence is there, a science center, Svalbard, because of their commitments to the Svalbard, the Spitsbergen Treaty. They have opened a new center in the north of Iceland. Maybe Alyson can give us some reflections on that. They are certainly, senior Chinese leaders are spending a lot of time in the Nordic states. There's an economic role there. There's a science role there. But and scholars that study Chinese behavior in both Antarctica as well as the Arctic see a lot of similarities. It's very long-term, it's strategic. It is about resource managing and gaining those resources, oil and gas, but also the rare earths play, I think, is very important for China in Greenland and elsewhere. We need to understand what a larger commercial footprint in Iceland, in a NATO country, in Greenland, what that means for our strategic purposes. And quite frankly, the United States hasn't been that observing of what that impact will be to have an opinion on it.
Thank you very much, Heather. Alyson Bales, I can't really even start enumerating your different and very important and distinguished positions, both as a diplomat and as a scholar. There's one thing I think that I figured out is that if you draw it as a line, you move constantly north, and now you ended up in Reykjavik.
Yes.
I know that you wanted to speak more about the non-military aspects of the Arctic situation. Well, I want to ask you, this Arctic craze, if I may call it a bit journalistically, was really sparked off by Lawrence Smith's book, The New North, and I think in popular imagination, at least it was so. So at that time, it was this view of, wow, we have a new frontier, and it's all very optimistic and wonderful, it's going to solve all the world's problems. Do you think that this image, this vision, is still relevant?
Well, like everyone else, I should first thank the organizers of this excellent conference, and thanks for giving me the chance to speak on this. I would indeed like to open up the big story of the Arctic and consider all the benefits, but particularly all the risks. Like any new area of exploration and development, it's full of traps. And they are not traps that lie only in power play between nations and the possible risks of that. perfectly correct that we have first concentrated in this conference on the military security aspect, the strategic implications of Russian actions. And I would absolutely share the emotional basis for that. Shock, dismay, disillusionment, yes. But at times like this, I'm always reminded of a saying of Martin Luther, that the world is like a drunken peasant. He scrambles up on his horse and immediately falls off the other side. So that while we face military security as the priority of the moment, we shouldn't forget all the other aspects that matter and that also overshadow the prospect of the North as a region of peace, as a region where human lives are protected and safe and where they can only get better. Because I think there are quite a lot of dark shadows that fall across that. Now, of course, aside the military discourse on the Arctic, for decades now we've had the alternative discourse of green security, environmental security, that what we should be doing at all costs is protecting the environment. Properly understood, green security means also protecting people from the environment and letting mankind have a productive environment, a productive relationship with the environment. It doesn't necessarily rule out economic activity. What it does lead to is exactly the same logic that, for me, the military analysis leads to, that it is very important to keep the peace in the Arctic. Not just for general reasons, but for two specific local reasons, that if you don't have peace, you lose whatever prospects we have of working together on the actual climate change challenge, where, okay, we don't have very close institutionalized cooperation, particularly with Russia and China, but we do start to see some national measures being taken in the way that they can tolerate, in the way that suits them. And secondly, all the military activity that has taken place right through the Cold War in the Arctic has left a poisonous legacy of conventional and nuclear military contamination, which we are still not getting a grip on, despite actually very good cooperation with Russia in that particular area. And that problem's not going to get any easier. But what I would like to do in the time that I have left is open up maybe even some further dimensions of security. And the one I'd like to start with is of really intense concern to Iceland, since we've mentioned Iceland. It's actually not the things that Niklas mentioned, although they're also important, but the risk of major civil emergencies, that is, natural disasters, the sinking of a cruise ship, which you did mention, possible breaking of energy cables. Let's face it, the weather in the Arctic is getting warmer, but also more violent. There are more violent winds, currents become unpredictable without ice cover, temperature extremes increase, and the local economy, as well as the local inhabitants, is simply not used to this. There have been more days in Iceland when the fishing fleet could not go out, and you can immediately see what that means for Iceland. There's a risk of communications, energy supplies breaking down. If you have a major shipping disaster, you have the risk of a massive oil spill. You also have the risk of massive human deaths, because you could have up to 2,000 on a cruise ship. And let's bear in mind that the populations along the coasts of Alaska, Canada, Siberia are so tiny that you might have to go thousands rather than hundreds of kilometers to get people into a suitable hospital. Locally, you might have 10 maternity beds, and that would be it. And all this is without even mentioning something that we tend to forget, that is the dangers on land. Because the permafrost is melting, it will release methane that speeds up climate change, but Russia in particular has vast industrial infrastructures, vast communications infrastructures built on permafrost. And they must be very frightened. I'm not surprised that they would not want to talk about it, but it will be a heavy economic and operational drag on Russia, which I think is one of the reasons, by the way, that the leaders of Russia try to stir up their people to accept that more money has to be spent there and more effort has to be made there. Now, it's very true that the Arctic Council has made important breakthroughs. It's got a legally binding agreement on search and rescue for these accidents at sea, and it's got a legally binding agreement on response to oil spills, and that is good for every kind of security, including environmental security. First and foremost, what these agreements do is allocate areas of responsibility, and they give huge areas of responsibility to Iceland and also to be attached to Greenland and the Faroes, whereas these three actors have practically no resources. I mean, Iceland has 2 Coast Guard ships, and one of them is usually on a NATO or EU operation in the Mediterranean, where it's warmer and they get paid for it. I mean, this is not a serious response to the growing risk of civil emergencies in the north. And yes, these agreements go on to provide a framework for cooperation. It's quite remarkable. I mean, I would underpin it, what everyone has said, that there have been real achievements here, real political achievements. The agreements would open up the way for Iceland to call on Russian Navy ships to come and help in an accident, which may now seem a rather unrealistic vision, but it was quite a fine vision at the time. Do we have the trust anymore to make that work? Do commercial companies have the necessary trust after Ukraine to go and invest up there? Do we know enough about each other's practices? That's what this Coast Guard Forum was meant to do. That was what the military talks were meant to do. Clearly, that's going to be very much more difficult now. And I am concerned that we're engaged in a kind of race against time with the risk of a really large civil emergency of this sort, and that race against time will be very dangerous and likely to go wrong under any scenario. If everything is fine in the Arctic, you will get more human activity and it will multiply the risks. If we fall back into a fragmented Arctic, where I don't actually see spontaneous conflict breaking out, it's much more likely to start on another front and then affect the Arctic. But what you would get is a compartmentalization of the Arctic, an inability to spread burdens and share resources, and the smallest nations who don't have the resources would have fewer to turn to. Now, just for a couple of minutes, I would like to further widen the range of security problems, mention a few problems of what are called human security. None of them will be a surprise to anyone who lives or has lived in that region. First of all, food security has always been a headache. Most of it has to be imported. The destabilizing of the climate and the environment is making it more likely that some kind of supply problems will occur there. At the time of the economic crash, Iceland was very lucky that a huge tanker with groceries had just arrived and we could eat that in the 2 or 3 days before the system of export payments got going again. Likewise with the volcano disaster. Added to that are warmer temperatures that mean that you cannot use the old method of conserving food by just putting it out in the snow. And there have been more outbreaks of food poisoning. Health, well, it is a problem. We have to face that in many northern communities. You have pollution problems, you have sexual problems, you have alcohol and abuse-related problems, aggravated often by high unemployment. Perhaps the Arctic development will help with the employment, perhaps not. At any rate, new diseases will be coming in with tourists and with new workers. And of course, new workers and the whole possible new pattern of migration into the region causes problems. It may destabilize local communities. It may lead to bad feeling of a kind that hasn't really been a problem up to now. But the guest workers themselves are at risk of being treated very badly, locked up in remote labor camps, not understanding the conditions, exposed to a very high accident rate and so on. I would not like to be a Chinese worker brought into Greenland, frankly. It's not only the Greenlanders who have a potential human security problem. To sum up on this, we do need international cooperation. It cannot be just the Arctic Council, not just because it doesn't have certain competences, but it doesn't cover all the countries involved. It doesn't cover all the countries flagging ships. It doesn't cover all the countries causing pollution. It doesn't cover all the countries from which migration may take place. And I think we should look seriously at further involvement of UN agencies, for example. The Security Council is a step too far, but UN agencies could do more. We should look more seriously at the role of the EU in regulations and models on aspects of civil security, because all the nations are either members or members of the EEA or partners. Very last remark. The Arctic is a zone of peace in one way that we don't usually notice. A lot of the rest of the world is plagued by weak states, leading to terrorism, crime, and civil conflict. There is no history of that in the Arctic. There hardly could be, with only 10 million inhabitants. who are longing for human contact rather than being willing to go to war with each other internally or to rise up as terrorists. We do, though, need the consent and the happiness and the engagement of the Arctic peoples to deal with precisely these civil security challenges. They're not going to make a difference to naval exercises or the deployment of missile defense. They will make a hell of a lot of difference to how well a major accident is dealt with. Governments have not really involved the people very much when they've been drawing up their Arctic policies and strategies. I think that's a fair criticism of every country, particularly the larger ones, and there should be more attention to democratization, if you like, of this Arctic agenda. Thank you.
Alyson, thank you very much, and thanks for a wonderful thanks for wonderful timekeeping, really. And I just realized that the problem is so vast, and there are more. I mean, we haven't touched upon, for example, the issue of repopulation of these areas, or population rather. And for example, Canada is addressing it via a very targeted immigration programs operated via its diplomatic missions, while Russia, I think, hasn't started yet even to think about who is going to exploit all these wonderful riches around there. So there are many aspects, but I think we have a good 20 minutes to ask questions, and I think the first hand I saw was over there, gentleman over there, and then you, sir. Please introduce yourselves as usual.
Thank you. Again, I'm Martin de Sitter. I'm the political advisor to the commander of NATO headquarters Brunsum. And by our location, we are also, in a way, responsible for the northern area, and especially the high north. And we have actually, and this is also directed at Heather, to allay your fears somewhat about NATO attention. We have been banging the drum for more attention in NATO to the high north. And this is also based on a very inspirational speech Minister Eide gave to the NATO Council in, I seem to remember, November 2012. To start with, we have a permanent NATO liaison officer in Reykjavik, looking after our interests and doing very well. We have NATO installations on Iceland, NATO radars. We have a maritime fuel facility there. And this is all going to be very relevant as Iceland regains an international strategic importance that it had in the Cold War. Not only because of the Ukrainian crisis, but because of the developments in the high north. A couple of things I would like to add in addition to all the interesting information we just heard. There are two very important conferences on the high north that I recommend to everybody. One is the Arctic Frontiers Conference in Tromsø in January. And then we have the Arctic Circle Conference organized by the Icelandic government in, I believe, Alyson, it's in September. The second iteration of this to come. We have also keeping an eye, of course, on what China is doing. And this is not only for the reasons you mentioned, Heather, it's also very commercial. We saw the first commercial vessel going from Yokohama to Rotterdam at the end of last year. So this is actually becoming a viable route. It would be even more viable if the Russians wouldn't impose such catastrophic fees on the shipping that passes over this northern passage. And whatever you may think of the ecological situation, this is going to develop into something that is going to be commercially very interesting for many aspects of many of our economies. And those of us who have important harbors will look at the development of Iceland as a hub in this whole stream. And it could become incredibly important as a sort of a dividing point between for the traffic going to either Europe, Southern Europe, and the American continent. So these were a couple of issues I wanted to add to the discussion. Finally, the business of the Icelandic Coast Guard. They have been working for Frontex indeed, but one of the reasons why this happens is they have not enough money to run the business if they don't get some of their activities paid for by the European Union. And then the final remark is, I believe the Icelandic government is working on a new strategic orientation paper with support of a number of NATO nations, and we look forward to how this is also going to cope with the new situation as we have as a result of Mr. Putin's antics. Thank you.
Mr. Eide, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to recognize that I'm very glad that Brønnøysund is following developments, and it was a very important point for us when I was in the Norwegian government, that to raise the interest in NATO for what's going on up here, up in the Arctic. And I want to explain that that was misunderstood by a lot of people, because it was not suggesting that this is an area of conflict. We still believe and will continue to believe that this is potentially and in principle going to stay an area of cooperation. But it was still relevant because, as Heather says, several NATO members are actually in the Arctic, and hence it is Article 5 territory. And it was a problem for us that the attention was so much diverted to out-of-area operations that were actually very little work on following what's going on there, as well as here in the Baltic and several other vicinities. Hence came the near core area initiative, and I'm very glad that that has led to fruition now in Eide.
Thanks a million. You, sir.
My name is Mindaugas Jukinas. I'm a scholar from Lithuania. But first of all, I would like to thank all panelists and the moderator for a superb fact and idea-finding mission about the hot Arctic policy-wise. Arctic, in my opinion, is a sui generis case, but that brings me to a bit wider perspective of the role of regions, sub-regions, or more actually the role of regional organizations. In a post-Cold War era, regional organizations like the Arctic Council, Barents Euro-Arctic Council, Council of the Baltic Sea States, the Northern Dimension, were meant to engage, also to engage Russia and to cooperate on the postmodern soft security, low politics issues. But this catalyst of Crimean events might bring the question back, is the business as usual? Does the sub-regional cooperation, as I guess Mr. Eide said, the laboratory in the Arctic, or laboratory in the Baltic Sea region, or the Baltic Sea strategy of the European Union, will they suffer setbacks? Or will they still be those engagement strategies as if nothing had happened?
Thanks a million for your question. Who wants to address it? Okay, Alyson, and then Heather.
Perhaps I could start, and thank you, Mindaugas. It's something I've been thinking about too. If we look back, these regional bodies were created between about 1992 and 96. So they've lived through the period when Russia was very strongly reacting against NATO enlargement, broke off the dialogue with NATO for a while. They've lived through Georgia. They've lived through various announcements on missile defense. And it does seem to be that Russia is more inclined to compartmentalize and to try to keep things going at this lower level where less is at stake, but where Russia also feels less threatened because there aren't binding agreements or rules involved. It's not losing its sovereignty. It's not being pushed into a corner in decision-making. To be honest, I would say I think it's our choice. I think it's the choice of the Western countries involved, whether we want to try to maintain what I would call the depoliticization or de-securitization of this whole group of bodies, including the Arctic Council, or do we want to show that we're angry everywhere and show that with more than words? It's not the primary decision we have to take now, but I actually think it may be one of the most difficult decisions to weigh up, and we do need to give some thought to that and try to understand a bit more what is special about this group of institutions.
Perfectly said.
Good.
Oh.
Niklas, you wanted to add it?
Yeah, I mean, very important point here. The institutions, I mean, they're hardy creatures. They can survive and they can hibernate and they can come back if the weather vane, Heather's weather vane, starts to point in a better direction than it's currently heading. But I also think that what we need to think about is how do we achieve an international division of labor between the security organizations, cooperative organizations, and the existing legal regimes that we actually have that are in effect. We have an IMO polar code, perhaps in a couple of years' time. That could go some way. What is NATO going to do? We heard some on that before earlier. Could EU do something more? Probably yes. And think consciously about how the division of labor should look. And how should, for instance, the UNCLOS develop in doing this? But that's what I would like to see, a comprehensive thought process on this.
Absolutely.
Two quick sentences to that. The first one is all the other issues like climate change and environmental challenges, the risk of disasters, they are as important even if we have the Crimea crisis. So we have to be able to have two thoughts in our head at the same time. Yes. The other one is that I believe that Russia understands that it's its own interest to maintain at least the basic structure of this Arctic cooperation. And I think the main reason for that lies further east of Russia.
Yeah, agreed.
That is
a big country.
Big country.
Yeah.
Starting with
The biggest. Okay.
Starting with the sea.
I saw another hand over there. René, that's you, right? Please.
I'm René Nyberg, Finland. Just a couple of factual points and on the Eurasian Arctic, the Northeastern Passage, if you want. 80% of all traffic is Kara Sea traffic.
Yes.
That is internal Russian traffic. That is the route to Eastern Siberia via Yenisei, and that is the route to Western Siberia via the Ob. We shouldn't forget about this. The Northern Sea Route, as the Russians call it, the Northeast Passage, is with new ice conditions, will open up for bulk, for gas, minerals, but it will never become anything for containers. And the gentleman referred to the horrible or outrageous Russian fees. These are outrageous fees for icebreaker assistance. Because at the best, the ice conditions there are like in the Gulf of Finland or in the northern Baltic Sea during wintertime. You need icebreaking assistance. Kostya had an interesting point about repopulation or depopulation. Think about a city like Norilsk. It's probably the gloomiest place you can imagine on Earth where to settle 300,000 people. It is not north. It's not the Arctic. It is beyond it. It's just difficult to describe.
René, but not that initially they settled there their own will. You know?
Yeah, but they're still there. My God,
yeah.
Maybe there.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe there are 200,000 left. So this is one of the internal Russian challenges. You have to do something with these settlements, which are too large, which are too populous, and which are absolutely, and the Russian expression for that is vahtavaya sistema. You want to copy the Canadians. I mean, you don't want to have permanent, but you'll send people for 15 days or 3 weeks and then back. So this is, this is the Arctic curse, as it were, in the famous book of Fiona Hill and this is of course something which has to be considered. And as Alyson rightly pointed out, the permafrost crisis will really hit them.
If I may digress for a second, because you mentioned Norilsk, and I think that the idea about 10 years ago, during the new sort of the beginnings of the new covenant between the Kremlin and the oligarchs, was that annexing group that effectively owns Norilsk will fix the place. But it turned out to be that even a big conglomerate like that cannot do it on its own and in isolation from a wider sort of context, if you wish. So, that's really worth mentioning. Really sorry to jump out of my moderator seat. Please, Niklas.
Yeah. René, this is absolutely correct, as you say. It's the western part of the Northeast Passage that is open for business. Due to the ice conditions, there is no ice there, or very little ice. But what we're seeing now is a big delta, and this is what I was alluding to in my presentation. The ice melt is faster than is expected. So if we freeze the moment and look at it now, this is what we have. But we may have a very different situation in 5 or 10 years' time. So I think that in 10 years' time, we will see the Northeast Passage open for business. And exactly as you say, outrageous rates for transit, that's there, and it's probably a bit of a teething problem. I think it's difficult also to ask the people who really are going to do this, namely the shipping agents, because for commercial reasons, they can't talk openly about what their plans are. But I'm willing to wager a substantial part of my princely civil servant salary that they are sitting behind closed doors and analyzing this very carefully. And when the stars are in the right alignment, they will begin. And then once one agency, shipping agency decided this, the others will say, they know something we don't, let's do it. And you will go from a very low number of passengers up to a very much higher number. And then you will have congestion and you will have risks for maritime hazards. That's what we're looking at. And this can happen faster than we think. And this is what I was alluding to when I was talking about non-linear moment. It suddenly happens. And then we're there and we have an emergency that has to be managed.
Alyson and then Espen, yeah.
If I could slightly disagree with you, Niklas, I mean, I don't disagree that this could happen at some point in the future. I just think how long it takes doesn't only depend on the way being physically open, or even on how much the Russians charge for hiring an icebreaker, because insurance is a massive problem at the moment. It's about twice as high for going anywhere in the Arctic. And for very good reasons, by the way, and reasons that will not go away. Melting ice means icebergs is one obvious one. And then are cargoes available? It's all very well saying the distance is shorter, but who at one end wants to buy something that is available at the other end, has no better way of going, and you can, the time factor is really important and so on. I've heard analysts, well-informed analysts from China, Japan, and South Korea, all at one particularly good symposium, all of whom said that they couldn't see the profit margin for some time yet. There would have to be fundamental changes, and not only of a physical sort. The reason why I wanted to say this, though, is to come back to a point that was made about Iceland developing as a shipping hub, for example. Who will pay? It's a catch-22, because in order to have safe and clean and sustainable operations in the Arctic, you need an enormous amount more in the way of support facilities, just plain commercial support facilities, than there is at the moment. So who's going to build those before anyone has really made a penny of true profit? Russia can spend state money to do it in its own zone. The rest of us are in a capitalist economy, and 6 years after a massive crash of the capitalist economy. Iceland is the most broke of everybody. And by the way, this is why Iceland and some of the smaller states look at China. You have to look for somebody who has money in their pockets.
Espen, very briefly, you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, no, I agree with Niklas, but I just want to point out it's not a theoretical option that something can happen. It's happening right now. And there have been commercial transport for at least 6 years. Not in very high volumes for exactly the reasons that were pointed out, but every single year, the time, summertime is longer. So last year you could travel until November, quite ice-free. And it's true in winter you can't, but it means a large part of the year. And what's the market? Well, iron ore from northern Norway to China is already being transported that route. So it's happening now, and there's every possible reason to believe that it's going to accelerate.
And the number of ships increase
every year. The number is going up. Although if you compare it to the Malacca Straits and Suez Canal, it's sort of very, very small, but still.
We have two last questions from that corner. A voice from Finland first, and I ask you both to be brief, and the answers, I would like you to be brief. I do want to, and more or less on time.
Normally, in occasions like this, one hears words such as continental shelf and Stockmanskoye and the kind of thing. We haven't heard very much about these things. How about the exploitation of the existing natural resources that are on the continental shelf? What are the prospects?
That's for you, Espen.
Heather?
Well, it's a great question. I failed to really note it. I think the next big challenge for the Arctic coastal states following the Law of the Sea Treaty is continuing to submit claims to extend their outer continental shelf. And I think this is a particularly one to focus on Russia resubmitting its claim this year for the Lamantsof and Mendeleev Ridge. This is a massive extension, could be. And you're starting to hear the nationalistic voices about that claim. And look, nationalism is not defined just to Russia in the Arctic. Our Canadian colleagues and Prime Minister Harper has certainly also added his domestic political view to this is, ours, and we need to provide that scientific data. So I think there is a cause for us to monitor this, but there's two forces at play. This is a long-term process through the UN that's going to take a long time, so I don't think this is going to be immediate in any stretch. And secondly, I'll go back to my point, the U.S. unconventional revolution, I think, is having an impact on the Arctic. The Arctic, particularly because what we're finding right now is mostly gas now, and gas prices are regionally based. There's some adjustments to that. Look at Shell in the Chukchi in the American Arctic. They spent $4.5 billion, and they really have nothing to show for it. And it's very unclear whether they're going to drill this year or not. We don't know. This is a huge investment. It's long-term, and I think if there's a cheaper, easier, less risky, reputationally risky adventure, they will go forward with that. This is for the future and keeping this on the reserves, and keeping the reserves on your books. That doesn't fit with the Russian timetable, but I think that's the international company's view. The dynamic here is starting to change, and I'm not sure the Russian government is quite recognizing of that change.
Thank you very much. The last question, gentleman over there.
Thank you. This is actually a comment. I had a chance to sail through the Northeast Passage together with other Arctic Council representatives a couple of years ago. And to my great amazement, we didn't see ice at all. I could have sailed with my own sailing boat, but I wouldn't have risked it, because the weather conditions, as was named here, said here earlier, are extremely changeable. They're unpredictable. And there's something which is called East Siberian Massive, meaning that the polar ice can float very rapidly and block all the fairways. And that is why the Russians actually reserve 2 icebreakers, even in the sailing season of August, which is the best sailing season, just to be in reserve. And additionally, they have to build quite an infrastructure, radars, helipads, which were all mentioned here. So I feel sympathy about the rates they are putting on the traffic. They actually compare it to Suez Canal rates and take into consideration the longer voyage there, requiring, of course, more fuel. So I think it's commercially based, at least quite close to commercially based, the rating system there.
So now I know I'm not hiring an icebreaker for my 50th birthday. Look, I think it was an absolutely great discussion which revealed so many things, and we haven't spoken about a lot of things, including population immigration, the icebreaker fleet that Russia has to build by 2020 or something like that. But even a glimpse of it was absolutely fascinating due to the panel. I was slightly absent-minded because I was thinking all this time what kind of job description it would be to serve as an ambassador to Greenland. But I think that we have so many interesting perspectives, and it's really great thanks to the organizers for putting this issue for discussion, and such a wonderful discussion at that. So please thank all the participants, and thank you.